Hey everyone, and welcome to Almost Cancelled. I am Peter, and today I am going to be talking about Utopia Season 1, Episode 4. It's called Not Slow, Not Bad. So, full spoilers for the episode, as always. This episode is an interesting one from a grading scale, because I think in some ways this is probably the most straightforward, kind of typical mid-episode of a show in that I don't know if it's got as much of a full arc of things to discuss. I feel like those first few episodes had a really strong kind of driving force where I feel like I'd been through a big journey by the end. This one feels a bit more lower key. Some of the subplots feel like they're a bit more subplotty, if that makes any sense. And what I mean by that is something as simple as like Rainn Wilson's character, the scientist, whose name I have already forgotten, Michael Stearns. He is trying to get into the quarantine zone in St. Louis, and I think what stuck out to me in this episode about his plot is that the scenes from last episode where he like tried to get in and failed towards the end of the episode. I'm not entirely sure that those need to be there. I feel like that could have been quickly achieved at the start of this episode without like having a whole scene doing it. It felt like it was kind of wasted time almost in a weird way. It was a couple of minutes we could have saved in the last episode because ultimately nothing would have been lost by just starting his plot in this episode with saying, "Oh, I tried to get in and couldn't," and he's or having just a very quicker version of the scene from last episode where he tries to get in and can't. I don't know if we needed the whole trying to bluff his way in sequence necessarily. I don't know if it added much, but that's to say that I dislike that plot. But it's just to say that this plot with him this episode and some of the other stuff as well, it felt a bit more like mid-season stuff in that I didn't necessarily get a full story from beginning, middle, and end of the episode. It's more just like, here's just a chunk of what this story is in the middle. Well, things have been moved around the board, whilst things are being set up for later. But there are some high points in this episode, particularly the ending is super dark and does serve a big purpose, mainly making sure that John Cusack's Dr. Christie, just how evil he is and vicious and cold. Throughout the episode, you're kind of teasing what the plan is to deal with various things. There's a scene earlier on that kind of kicks all this plot off where his son Thomas is running a meeting with some other people, most notably Kara, who's been kind of around. Notably played by Fiona Dourif, who, of course, is Brad Dourif's daughter and has been in a couple of the recent Chucky movies. That's where I know her from. I think she's been in some other stuff as well, but that's where I know her mainly. But she seems to be on board with the plans. This is one of the most interesting scenes in the episode for me, I thought, because they're talking about, okay, we have to find this kid, we have to find Utopia, we have to find Jessica Hyde. And she seems to be on board with whatever the plan is. Kara is completely on board with whatever goal they have for intentionally releasing these viruses, and does basically confirm in this scene that they all accepted the loss of children's lives that are happening because of the outbreak. They've accepted that part of it, and she knew that. But she does not accept the thing that Thomas then suggests, and to try and flush out Grant is to, it involves basically killing a bunch of kids in a park. And she's like, no, my kid's playing that part. And she gets really upset. She says, no, there has to be a line. There has to be a moral line that we will not cross. So it really makes me intrigued because we don't really know what their end game is. We don't really know what their ultimate goal is. And I'm struggling to think of something where she's okay with the loss of children via an intended virus outbreak, which later is confirmed that it was her idea to give like a false positive or like make the FBI and the CDC or whatever investigate the meat, the was it the Sim Pro. Like, it was her idea to do that because the idea being that once they've investigated it and it's clean and it's not in any way responsible for anything going on, all of a sudden, Christie, aka, or I assume aka, Mr. Rabbit, comes out looking super innocent, and it will take a lot for them to do a 180 and then check him again, kind of thing. So that scene was fascinating to me, but ultimately she doesn't sound thrilled and voices some dissent. Later, she's with Dr. Christie, and he says that no, she's going to like hold the fort and not be sort of in the mission anymore, and tries to sort of play it up as like, oh, I've got concerns about Thomas, I need to keep an eye on him, and I think I'm going to need you to help me do this or that. So there's a reveal at the end when the plan that's going on through the episode with Arby, where Arby's taking a child who looks as close to Grant as they can get out of their, I don't know, private classroom. I think some of this ties into what Jessica talks about home and what home is in the episode. But there's like a classroom that he goes into and just picks a kid, and he picks the one who looks the most like Grant. He's got the short, dark hair, got a Grant sort of type appearance, similar age, and there's some, dastardly plan, and it sounds dastardly even before we get to the ending where Dr. Christie talks to Arby and tries to, and this is where the title of the episode comes from, tries to make sure he understands that it should be merciful, that, like, implying that he's going to have to eventually kill this kid that they've picked to stand in for Grant, for whatever story they're going to create in the news to try and flush out information on him. And Arby's response is, "Oh, not slow and not bad." That's how he, perceives like it being a merciful kill, or I don't know if merciful was the word that they actually used, but it was the same, vibe. Humane. It was humane. It should be humane. And it's like, okay, this is really dark and really sinister already. But so they're going into this house, but although as I said, everything before then, when they're outside in the van and he makes the kid put on gloves that have Grant's fingerprints on the tips, and then he makes him hold this machine gun, and then they're like, okay, so this is what we're going to do, and they go, and the kid goes in first and intentionally touches various things in the house, and we see Arby walk in, kill someone who runs into him immediately. And then it's around this time it reveals who this, because at first you're thinking this is a random house, but then you see Kara. It's Fiona Dourif's character, who, upon hearing the gunshot, essentially realizes what's happening very quickly, and we hear her plead with Arby very, very quickly before it doesn't show the gunshots. We cut to other, an exterior or another room, and we hear the gunshots. We see some of the aftermath, some blood on some, dishes on the table, things like that. It shoots it without showing us the actual carnage, which I think is important because the majority of the people in this scene are children. And so not only do we have that, not only do we have the fact that earlier on in the episode when Dr. Christie was talking to her, he actually held her child and sort of like sniffed the kid's head and was like, oh, new baby smell and all the rest of it. He was actually being very, seemingly lovingly affectionate to this child, knowing full well what the plan is going to be to murder her and her whole family. And it makes sense when you think about, from a dark perspective of, she was voicing dissent, and their entire thing has been to kill anyone who knows anything about Utopia, who knows anything about Jessica Hyde. They want to erase every single fragment of a path that could lead back to them. So the idea that she's even shown a hint of one day being a problem that they're going to have to deal with, that they can't trust to go all the way with these various things. They're essentially solving two problems, two birds with one stone here, because they're taking her out and using this crime, this massacre as their plan for the Grant, flushing out. So super, super dark. And then of course there's the ending with Arby himself, where he sees one last kid and he's eating a little box of raisins, which was the same box of raisins that Christie gave to him. And he does actually feel something from this. He shoots the kid. We just see the raisins land on the floor, and then the episode ends with Arby screaming. And I feel like the idea that he's finally feeling something, that he's not just a complete sociopath finally, and maybe it's because this kid reminds him of himself, that had the dominoes fallen just slightly differently, this would have been him being murdered as a kid. I mean, maybe that's why this is finally hit. But regardless, it's this idea that Christie does have a lot of not only children in his family, but he seems to have a lot of children in kind of an extended family or system or social group, or the actual details are kind of bizarrely murky. But the ending's super dark. Like, it's one of those things where I wasn't like not liking the episode. I was I was enjoying some of the exposition and the teasing of the mysteries as it was going, but I wasn't as super enthralled as I was with some of the previous episodes, and the ending kind of like snapped me back to life. Where it was like, oh shit, this was actually really dark. This was really sinister. Uh, so it jump over to some other things. Alice still has some pages of Utopia, which Grant left with her, but and Grant's first meeting with Jessica Hyde goes about as well as you'd expect, with given how she is with people and how he is with people. And it becomes a bit of a tug of war and a sort of standoff, and ultimately he agrees to let her look, along with the rest of the group, at the pages, and they try to figure things out. It leads to a phone number, which leads them, and it's tied to the numbers that were under the nails from last episode. And they're on the way to a location because they phone this person who's it turns out is at the Department of Homeland Security, and at first they say they don't know them. Also, I think this actress was in The Wire. I think I recognize her from The Wire. But she phones back like almost like immediately late, seconds later, and gives them a location and some instructions. They set fire to the house. I thought that was an interesting touch. Actually, was that like there was a concern perhaps that I never really felt yet, but now that they've done this, like it's kind of avoided a concern that could have like come up, where we might have felt that half the season was going to end up be spent in this house, this farmhouse, to save money. It's something that sometimes TV shows do, that where once they establish a location they can stay at, they just stay there for a long time, and you kind of feel the lack of variety. You feel that they're kind of trying to save money, and I don't know if this is intentional necessarily, but it does kind of have a meta feeling to like them burning the house down here, like just halfway or even just a third of the way through episode 4, to say, hey, we're not going to spend the rest of the season here. This was a prime location for about 2.5 episodes, and now we're gone. And you don't have to worry about coming back. And they leave Sam's body to be found. Although they have to talk Jessica out of burning that too. They come up with a reason why Jessica will go along with it, but ultimately, of course, they really want to do it because they don't want to. They want to make sure her family finds out about her. They want there to be some memory of her, and reasons that Jessica just will not relate to. And it's interesting, comparing the characters here, how Jessica and Arby, there are like parallels here to talk about, where they've clearly both been raised in a less than regular environment, and they both have extreme sociopathic tendencies. And naturally, we gravitate towards Jessica Hyde a little bit because she's opposing the villain, and Arby's working for the villain. But it's hard not to like notice the similar. I'm talking about how she can't relate to why they care about their dead friend, or why she can't like communicate with someone, or whatever. And Arby's kind of the same way. That entire meeting scene that I was talking about had Arby in the background just eating his raisins. He said a couple of things, but he was mostly just standing there, kind of observing. And I suppose that's the difference between him and Jessica, is that Jessica would just storm into the meeting and make it all about what she wants in the meeting, whereas Arby's like sort of he's being coy, he's standing there, and maybe that's because he's trained to be following the orders of Dr. Christie and perhaps even his son. So no, but there are some tidbits here. So not all of them go out of somewhat safety. Ian and Becky go to, it turns out to be an abandoned Toys R Us, which is if nothing else symbolizes 2020 to people. It's just a derelict toy store that went out of business before all the bad things even started happening. And this woman from the Homeland Security kind of gives, and she's upset that it's not Jessica Hyde, and she's not willing to do too much, though she does give them a phone on the way out to say, basically give to Jessica if Jessica's interested in actually talking. But because at first she thinks it's Becky that's Jessica, and then realizes quite quickly that it's not, which suggests that no one really even knows what Jessica Hyde looks like. But we get some backstory where Mr. Rabbit, who has that name because he was branded with a rabbit after it's what it sounds like, releasing SARS. Becky kind of suggests that's what she's talking about, where he was supposed to develop a virus. And they backed out at the last second, so he just went to China on his own, released it anyway, and it killed hundreds of people. And that is just obviously a super dark thing to tie into the real world, which is kind of weird in the context. I mean, I know when they wrote this and when the original was written, obviously the events of 2020, the pandemic, wasn't anything anyone knew about, but it is kind of weird watching this and having them, and this is not a unique thing to this show. Tons of shows do this, where they'll use real, bad historic events to kind of like tie into their fictional thing that they're doing in the story. That's normal. Tons of stuff does it. Star Trek does it a lot, or at least references a lot of like both real and fictitious, tragedies and things like that. And it happens all the time. How often is Pearl Harbor or 9/11 brought up in things? And then it's like, yeah, that happened. In fact, hell, that's even brought up in this scene because she says that after 9/11, there was like an arms race and viruses and biological warfare. And obviously, as a Resident Evil fan, I'm thinking of the T virus, and I'm thinking Umbrella Corporation's behind it all, and all the rest of it. The games, not the movies, do not start with me. Anyway, so, but the thing, yeah, so we find out that basically, it's, Mr. Rabbit's someone who went rogue and tried to sell to around the world. That still went bad. He released it anyway. He got caught and branded, and out of like self-preservation, went around killing everyone who knew who he was, at least as much as he could tell. And he ended up killing like 63, 64 people, something in that range. And what's interesting about that is that that sounds very similar to what's going on this season with people killing anyone who has come into contact with Utopia. These things are very much lining up. Thematically, it feels like it's the same person behind that who is Mr. Rabbit. And and it's not a surprise. Like Christie, unless they try and pull some insane twist on us, it looks like he is Mr. Rabbit. But all of these storytelling things are saying that it is. Not just because he's the obvious choice, but because the way that he has his men acting and covering things up is very similar to what we hear here about Mr. Rabbit. But Mr. Rabbit wants to kill Jessica Hyde because Jessica Hyde knows something that he doesn't want her to know. And the same goes for Utopia, which they in the car afterwards theorize is that Jessica knows who Mr. Rabbit is. She can't remember him, but Mr. Rabbit used to bring her cookies. And what do we see in this episode? We see Christie being friendly with children, and we see him giving kids treats, although it's more raisins than cookies, admittedly. But and even the classroom, this little classroom building that we see that Arby goes into, when Jessica then starts talking about the house she lived up in, she lived in a house with no adults. Her dad would visit occasionally. Mr. Rabbit would visit with cookies, but it kind of sounds like she was on some sort of weird little, insular system of like or campus or something like that, where something like a Christie like owns a bit of land with a bunch of buildings in it, and it's like a little like insular community that is cut off from the world or something like that. And then maybe she was living in such a place. And is this when she was officially kidnapped and her dad was being forced to make all these various viruses and stuff. And some moral questions are raised here where is Jessica's life worth the lives of all the kids that are dying right now? Ian or Becky bring that point up early on, like was it justifiable your dad did this? I mean, okay, obviously he didn't want his daughter to die, but look at how many kids are dying now because of this. Were you worth all of that? And that's an interesting question to raise, I think, going into this. And the mystery here, the mystery of actually like her knowing who Mr. Rabbit is but not really remembering it, and them kind of realizing that's what she probably does know. Like, I mean, I don't know if the season's going to end with them finding out that it's Christie, or we find out that we're wrong in assuming that and it is someone else, but it seems like that's definitely the big sticking point now for the season now that we're halfway through. I mean, hell, maybe they'll find out next episode and we'll keep going, because for the most part this show has surprised me with how quickly it's advanced episode to episode. This episode I would say is the one that doesn't, and it's not necessarily a critique, because like I say, I was surprised with how much episode 2 advanced the plot, and to a lesser extent, but I was still fairly happy with how much advanced in episode 3. Episode 4 feels like it's more of a normal pacing. And that's not to say that it felt slow. It felt like it was a well-paced episode of TV, but it wasn't as shockingly like moving through the plot ideas as the previous episodes had been. But it does have a big shocking ending, which I did enjoy. And just to go back to Stearns, they're pissed that he's involved, and he was supposed to just do what he was told and shut up, and there'd be no problems. But now that he actually wants to investigate the virus, it's actually a risk to whatever they're doing, because he'll realize that there's some foul play going on here and whatever. He befriends some parents who have been protesting outside the quarantine zone. One in particular, who he then actually has come in with them when he eventually gets clearance. And you feel like him getting clearance from the company, from Dr. Christie, is obviously them trying to, is whatever their new plan is, to discredit him or maybe kill him, or solve the problem of him realizing what's going on here. You feel I felt worried as soon as they said, "Oh, you've got clearance now. You know, your boss or whoever's called in, and you're officially here as a representative of blah blah blah." I thought, "Oh no, this is their plan. This is what they're trying to do," and I felt worried, and I suspect that he's going to be in some danger. But he does blag his way in with a friend. He's like, "Hey, this is my scientific assistant," or something to that effect. And this guy gets to speak to his daughter, who's clearly sick and dying, which is the last we see of them. But it's one of those things where there was definitely some more TV pacing plots in this episode, where I felt kind of just we're almost just doing a little bit of this Christie stuff to keep that bubbling over, so we don't forget about it. I exactly felt like we could have cut like one of the scenes from last episode. It didn't really need to be there, but no, I still enjoyed the episode though. I think if anything, what I will give it the win in is the shocking ending, feeling super dark in a way that's still surprising me a little bit in this. But the other thing that I really appreciated here is that probably the one thing that I wasn't as big on last episode is I said that the mystery wasn't as interesting to me, but I like the characters a lot. I think this episode I still like the characters a lot. I mean, there's little details like when Ian and Becky are sitting down in that little kid's stool when they're in that meeting with the women, and they're kind of like awkwardly trying to both fit on it, and there's some humor there that I really enjoy, just some little body language stuff that makes them very endearing and feel like more real goofy people than people who belong in this conspiracy, and it makes them feel more vulnerable as a result, as opposed to Jessica, who feels like she could take on an army. That's potentially. But what I'm getting to though is that I do like the mystery more in this episode. I like the mythology building that it's done here. The idea that there's more to whatever like world she grew up in. Beyond just being kidnapped. The idea that Christie has so much more going on, and and if he is Mr. Rabbit, then how did he shed his identity so well that he could then become a relatively public figure as the head of this bio corporation? It's not like he's someone who doesn't get seen, or did he have like plastic surgery on his face? Did he? I don't know. Like there's potential here, and maybe that's where there's room for there being a twist that it's not actually him, but maybe in some way he's related to the real Mr. Rabbit, because there's a lot of things that are thematically linking up between what he's doing and his tactics, specifically with his henchmen and what he has them doing, to what we hear about Mr. Rabbit from Utopia and from Jessica. So, yeah, I'm into it. So, no, good episode. Good episode. It may actually break even with the last episode, to be honest. It's just good at different things. But yeah, so now I'm still enjoying the show. Looking forward to episode 5, which I'll hopefully have for you very soon. I'm want to try and fire through the season as quickly as I can, mainly because The Haunting of Bly Manor is out on Friday. I don't think I'm going to quite get this finished by then, but if I can get almost all of it done by then, that'll put us in good stead for wrapping up in a timely fashion. So let me know what you thought of the episode in the comments. Like and subscribe, all that stuff. Liking is super important on YouTube. It is the easiest and the free way to support us, and will help keep all the content coming. But you can, of course, get us also on patreon.com/MailFuzzTV for as little as $1 per month, and help keep all the content coming that way. Get some bonuses. So go and have a look and see if you're interested in that. Catch us on Twitter @mailed_fuzz for channel updates. But otherwise, that is me. So thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV, guys. Have you got any vanilla?